Great. It's good to see everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are in the world. And welcome to today's guest presentation for AI Academy 2024. I'm Sean Michael Morris, Vice President of Academics Course Hero and a facilitator in AI Academy, and it's my absolute pleasure to welcome you. This week in AI Academy, we're tackling the sticky problem of ethics, especially the issue of academic integrity. And we couldn't have a better speaker to lead that way into that conversation. Stephen Kelts is a lecturer at the University Center for Human Values at Princeton University. Wait, did I get that right? Yes, Princeton, sorry. Yes, it's right there. It's all around him. He's also an ethics advisor to the Responsible A.I. Institute. His research recently focuses on the special nature of today's tech firms and their potential for ethical action, including an article in a special issue of Technology and Society magazine. He's the recipient of a grant from Princeton's Council on Science and Technology for a program called Agile Ethics, aimed at teaching undergraduate computer science and engineering majors how to consider ethical issues within their professional workflows. Stephen also has led the GradFutures initiative on ethics of AI for Princeton's graduate school, with the objective of encouraging Ph.D. candidates in all disciplines to apply their expertise in the field of tech ethics at universities or in corporations. Stephen is a wealth of knowledge, so be sure to post your questions in the Q&A and in the chat. And of course, we'll also make the recording available as soon as possible after the session closes. And you can find out more about Stephen at stephenkelts.com. And now, without further ado, please welcome Dr. Stephen Kelts. Stephen, thank you so much for joining us today. The stage is yours.
Hi, thank you for inviting me. I appreciate that. And thank you for that warm introduction, Sean. Rather than just highlighting some of the things that I do, what I want to focus on some of those things that I do that Sean mentioned is the way in which I'm engaged in ethics in a particular way, that is attempting to intervene with undergraduates to help teach them how to make better ethical decisions as they are, for instance, programming. I do some work with tech companies, helping them make better, teach engineers how to make better ethical decisions. And then I'm working with grad students, teaching them how to kind of get into this field. So I like to take ethics as a very practical discipline, right? An ethicist might do a number of things. They might lecture at you about the works of Immanuel Kant. I've done that before. They might tell you what's the right and the wrong thing to do, like the ethicist in the New York Times does. I rarely do any of that. And more importantly, what I do is work with people to figure out what they mean by ethics, what they mean by their values. One of the most interesting things about ethics is that in many ways we endorse the same values, we give the same top-level names to them, like academic honesty, anti-plagiarism, respect, copyright, be good. We give the same top-level names to them, but there's disagreement under the surface of how we use those. So an ethicist who's doing that third type of activity is going to engage in checking out how it is that people ordinarily use ethical language in their discourse, and also what their intuitions tell them about the right or wrong actions to take. All right, so why do I start there? Let's start the slide deck from there if we can. Why do I start there? Because my type of ethics begins with a question, always. A question for you. That's what's really important here. Why is plagiarism wrong? And as you think about that, allow yourself to think, is it wrong? And what I'd love for you to do is actually use the chat right now to go ahead and give some of your reasoning for why you think that plagiarism might just be wrong. I'll be quiet here for a second while you drop some ideas, and then we'll look at some of those ideas. It's a form of theft, okay? A property-based idea, theft, property. Someone else's work off as your own. Yeah, ownership of talent. Copyright, I saw came. I'm so glad there are so many participants that they're coming by almost too fast for me to see. Keep it coming. Theft and fraud, dishonesty is coming up, right? Comes down to profit. That sounds like the ability to profit off of one's own work is what we mean there. Doesn't allow the writer to demonstrate their proficiency. Okay, so it's about the writer's skill. can't call someone else's work your own for some reason, lacks academic integrity. The student themselves is not learning. It's a misrepresentation, so another form of fraud, as someone said earlier. Okay, so yes. So what I'd like to do is classify what are some of the common perceptions of this here, right? And we saw all three of these show up. We saw people engaged in rights talk. The author has the right to their work. They have a property over their work. They have an intellectual property over their work. They have control of their work, and etc. But I want to question that actually for a couple of minutes and actually ask, do class assignments actually violate copyright or any right? I'm going to focus on copyright, but classroom assignments of the sort your students do, I'm going to suggest to you for a few minutes, might not actually violate rights. It's also common for people to engage in a form of honesty talk when they try to say why plagiarism is wrong, right? You shouldn't present their work as yours. Someone said exactly that in the chat. But you know what? Looking at it from the student's perspective, that's actually a really confusing thing to say. If you're, let's say, working with 11th and 12th graders, if you're working for with college students, for much of their academic careers, they have been asked to do exactly that, right? Or at least a version of it, right? Write me a paper which summarizes and gets to the main point of Freud's theory in civilization and its discontents. That actually blurs the line between what Freud's ideas are and what the assignment is. Maybe it's just reporting on Freud's ideas. And if asked then, this is an important one, right? If asked then to kind of use Freud's ideas, they might just refer to the id and the ego and etc., and not actually refer to Freud. Right? And then if they were hanging out with their friends a little bit later on in the day, right? And something came up about psychology, they might just refer to the id and the ego without any classroom reference to Freud. They might actually take it as their idea. And in a lot of ways, we want to encourage that. I'll get to that in a second, right? So students are actually sometimes confused by the honesty talk. And if you've had students from multiple different national education systems in your classroom, you might see that sometimes students are in fact told that so long as they understand a paper that they're handing in, that work is theirs, right? But then there's also skills talk. And I want to encourage you actually to think of plagiarism or anti-plagiarism as a skill. Right? Plagiarism is not a skill, it's the lack of a skill. Anti-plagiarism is a skill. And the skills talk is when we say, you grow in some way by practicing this skill yourself. But as I say on the slide, here AI is, I think, the greatest threat to us. And it's why so many of us have panicked and that's why so many of you have signed up for a course like this to learn what this threatening device can do. The only evidence we've ever had of skills acquisition in our students is the completed assignments. And now some LLMs, for instance, and others can generate art, but LLMs can generate words, and it looks like a completed assignment. So how would we know that there's skills acquisition? I'm going to try to suggest to you there are ways that we can. So moving on to the next slide, then, right? The question here is, do simple statements on academic integrity really fit the bill anymore? This is the one that's in the student book of rights, rules, and responsibilities for my students at Princeton. And at the end of everything that they hand in, undergraduates have to write the following sentence and sign their name. This paper represents my own work in accordance with university regulations, and it is called the Student Acknowledgement of Original Work. But in the age of AI, what does it mean to be the origin of work? What does it mean for some work to be my own even? We're going to come back to that in a few minutes after we've maybe begun to explore it a little bit more. So then moving on to the next slide, let me tell you that in a lot of ways, copyright is quite curious and doesn't provide us with a lot of guidance as to how we should judge what is one's own work, right? And I'm going to get back to this again in a second. Copyright becomes a little bit more complicated in the age of AI, right? But copyright is really quite curious. There are a couple of basic elements that a work has to possess in order to be protected by copyright. And this is under US law. It may not apply in your jurisdiction, right? But under US law, the work's got to be original in some sense, Okay, so we see that concept of the origin coming out. So to get a copyright, a work has to be the original work of the author. Now, that doesn't mean it has to be like a novel invention in the way that it would be to get a patent. It just basically means that the work can't be a straight up copy of something else, right? Here in the US also, the work has to show some creativity, but our courts have said it only has to show a modicum of creativity to be creative enough for copyright, to be original enough to be copyright. So it simply can't be a copy of something else. It has to have a modicum of creativity in it, and it has to be in a fixed medium here in the US. Okay? It can't be in a purely ephemeral space. So that ordinarily meant writing it down on paper, but courts have interpreted this to mean something as temporary as being copied onto a RAM memory or maybe even a USB drive that is now in a fixed medium. But you see, the bar to satisfy these elements is very, very low. So original work, my own work under copyright law would be a very, very low bar. And here's another weird thing about copyright. Copyright relies on something that's called the idea-expression dichotomy here in the United States. Right? You can copyright your expression of an idea, but not the idea itself. So that would mean J.K. Rowling can copyright the specifics of her Harry Potter story, but fan fiction can write very similar stories about young wizards with girlfriends named something like Hermione who face a major villain and enemy and etc. So they can write very similar works because only J.K. Rowling's particular expression of the idea is protected. The idea is not protected. And here we think that that helps protect free speech rights, right? But again, let me repeat, that's confusing to students. They learn something in class and they can use it in casual conversation. We encourage them to use it in casual conversation. Go ahead, go out there, talk about the id and the ego. You don't have to reference Freud, just use these ideas. But boy, oh boy, when you enter those four walls of the classroom or when you hand in a written assignment, you better not do what is acceptable in the rest of society. The rest of society is really governed by copyright law, but that's maybe not what's governing the classroom. Plagiarism is about giving sort of proper attribution to an idea, right? But when you think about what's out there in society with respect to copyright, West Side Story, a famous Broadway musical, didn't have to footnote Romeo and Juliet to be acceptable. It could use the story, but give its own expression to it. So again, these things are confusing to students. What's the boundary line between plagiarism and what I am otherwise allowed to do with ideas under a copyright rule? So you might be asking yourself, is copyright just simply irrelevant in the classroom? Well, not surprisingly, there are at least three sides to this debate, right? The first side would be the yes side. Copyright is just simply irrelevant. And they would say academic work, like for instance, a student paper or a paper that a professor might write, qualifies for an exemption under copyright law, the fair use exemption. I'll get into that on the next slide. There are other people who say, no, copyright is not irrelevant at all. And one way in which it's not irrelevant is that the academic business model relies on it. Professors can't get any even slight compensation for the works that they write unless those are copyrighted. The readings that they assign to students must be cleared from copyright and so on and so forth. But there's a hybrid position here, which is, well, maybe copyright isn't irrelevant anymore. Maybe it was irrelevant to the classroom, but it's not irrelevant anymore. Because maybe AI just simply is a de facto copyright violation. And if so, we'd be uncomfortable with our students using it, right? And not only perhaps would they be engaged in academic dishonesty, but they'd be crossing a much lower barrier, maybe that is doing a much worse thing, which is violating copyright law. And I'm going to get into that in a second with respect to the inputs. So copyrighted materials can be input into AI, and people are worried, gosh, if OpenAI has sucked up a vast majority of the copyrighted material on the internet in order to train its models, does that violate copyright? But it might violate copyright also on the output. It might create something which is substantially similar, for instance, to a Picasso painting. And when it has done that, does it violate a copyright that the estate of Pablo Picasso might have, right? Or if you prompt it to produce some output, could it be the case excuse me, could it be the case that you own copyright in that output? Right? So we have questions at the output level as well. So then moving on to the next slide, I'll just talk for 2 seconds about what copyright in the analog age used to look like. In the US law, at least, there are 4 factors of fair use. So one has an exemption from following copyright law if they've engaged in fair use. That is, if they've transformed the work that is in front of them, the purpose and the character of your use is transformative in its form. And again, it could still be the story of Romeo and Juliet, but you've transformed it in its form into the story of the Sharks and the Jets and West Side Story. Another factor is type. The nature of the copyrighted work might itself come in for more or less protection. A purely factual work would have much less copyright protection. An unpublished work would have more copyright protection. Right? I'm not going to get into that, although because this isn't a seminar on law, but it's interesting. Substantiality, right? The amount of the portion of the work that was taken actually matters under U.S. law. So a small quote, a block quote, a few pages, for instance. But how much of the work does that really constitute? And then also copyright is affected by market crowding here in the United States as well. So in other words, even if I transform a piece of work, even if I turn it into a different type, even if I don't take a substantial portion of it, if in some sense I have crowded out the size of the market available to the original work, then I'm violating this 4th prong. That doesn't automatically mean I've violated copyright, but I violated this 4th prong here. And some lawyers will tell you there's kind of an unofficial 5th factor as well, the judge's feelings. If the thing that you have transformed this work into is a disgusting parody of some sort, the famous case is the Garbage Pail Kids, then that might actually violate the copyright of the Cabbage Patch Kids. So the judge just might feel that this transformation, it satisfies all the other criteria. It's not a violation of copyright, but it's kind of ugly. And this seems like a violation of copyright to some judges. Okay. All right. So maybe because of this, copyright just doesn't apply to academic work, right? Student assignments have no market effect. They don't shut down the market for another piece of work, right? Although they may not transform a piece of work, if they just do a summary of Freud's civilization and its discontents, they may not transform that work much, but they're not competing with the publication of Freud's civilization and its discontents. Academic publications that professors might do are transformative, and of course they have no market at all, right? So they come in for the fair use exemption, right? But we also have to be considering as we go through these things, what sort of example do we set for our students? One of the reasons why we might not just hand them off free PDFs of work is we're trying to set for them an example of what it means to respect copyright, but also what sort of example are we setting for them in the age of AI? So moving on then to the next slide, I'm going to recommend to you, and there are links here. You'll get these slides later, I believe, but I'm going to recommend to you the work of Mark Lemley in this regard, thinking about copyright in the age of AI. Mark Lemley the first article thinks about the inputs going into AI, and the question there in inputs is what a model is learning from in its training data. And given what you now know about copyright law here, if it's learning only ideas, then that's fine, right? Because ideas are not protected. If it's learning the writing style of an author, let's say, or the style of a Picasso painting, is that the particular expression? Probably not, because it's maybe not in a fixed medium. Picasso's style comes out by looking at all of his paintings en masse. His style is not itself in a fixed medium. So if it learns Picasso's style, it may not be violating copyright. But what if it regurgitates specifics of a presentation, specifics of a Picasso painting? Okay, now that's going to be a problem. That's going to mean that it's picking up things in its training data that are protected by copyright. The second article deals with the question of outputs, right? And what we do here in the US is we protect the human input that goes into prompts, or at least that's what we've started to talk about doing, right? So we say, hey, is the output of an AI model protected? No, it's probably not, but we'll protect the human input, the prompts that you've been learning to do, right? But Lemley argues, look, if we do that, we basically turn copyright on its head, because then we'd be protecting ideas and not the expression of them, right? Give me a painting of a woman in the style of a Picasso. That's just an idea. And we'd also undermine the substantial similarity test, because the same prompts that you input into the model and I input into the model could give us different results. So there's no sense in which my selection of my prompt words was a copying of another work, even if it generated an exact replica of an existing work, because I could point to the fact that entering that prompt in again and again and again isn't a copying, even if this one particular instance kicked out an exact replica. Okay, so the copyright in the age of AI has become really complicated in this regard. And you may know that the FTC here, the Federal Trade Commission, has started to look into this. And if you wanted to follow that link later, you would see them say this in their press release. Not only may creators' ability to compete be unfairly harmed, but consumers may be deceived when authorship does not align with consumer expectations. A consumer may think a work has been created by a particular musician or other artist when it is an AI-created product. So they said they have started to actually come aggressively at this question of whether AI violates copyright, both in its input and in its output. And they've started to prosecute people on this front, or particularly to prosecute some of the larger companies on this front. Okay, so copyright all of a sudden became relevant again, but seriously complicated in the age of AI. Let's move on to the question of, to the next slide, slide 8, and the question of the virtue and vice of anti-plagiarism, right? There's a lot of talk within ethics about this old book here that you see in front of you, which is called Rights Talk, right? So there's some people that believe we should seriously get beyond rights talk. If we engage in rights talk, you saw where we just went. We just walked into a complicated question of whether these models are themselves violators of copyrights in either their inputs or their outputs. And we may want to model good behavior for our students in that regard. We may want to ask ourselves those questions so that our students see us behaving well when it comes to copyright. But the true question from their perspective is really a question of their personal behavior. Rights talk gets us talking about whether they've crossed a line that is constituted in the law, whether their professor has crossed a line constituted in the law, whether OpenAI has crossed a line constituted in the law. But virtue and vice talk gets them talking about their personal growth as a creator, right? So virtue talk seems like it's outdated to a lot of people. It seems like it must have been something from the 19th century. Virtue talk must have been, it seems like it must be simply about prim and proper sexual morality. But virtue talk is a surviving and really quite large movement within ethical theory, which talks about virtue as sort of a learned behavior. And it's a learned behavior that we imbibe from examples around us in our environment, but which we then sort of enact in our own ways. We do different things in different circumstances. We do the things that suit our circumstances. So let's say the first time a young girl learned bravery, courage, was when she saw her father defend his family against a rabid dog. So he defended something of value, family, against threat, rabid dog. But then as she grows and matures, she could say, for instance, see a friend's mother who is fighting cancer and say that person is brave, right? Even though she only learned it in one instance, she was able to take that lesson about courage or about bravery and enact it, see it enacted in a different way that suits the circumstances that it is part of. And then at some point down the line, she may even actually stand up to the norms of her own society by protesting or something like that, right? Because she has learned how to apply courage in new circumstances. So what if it were the case that academic honesty, anti-plagiarism, is a learned skill that we need to sort of teach our students? We need to teach them how to do academic work, right? So that they learn the skill of doing it in their own ways, right? We can't just ask for them to be creative. We have to teach them a skill. But here's a suggestion to you. We're going to move on to an exercise for you in just 60 seconds here. But here's a suggestion to you about learned skills, right? Sometimes we don't treat our students as young apprentices learning skills that they need to practice and apply and generalize and etc. Sometimes we treat them as if they're like little language models or little math models or little science models, right? We want them to read and understand something and be able to explain it in detail, but then we don't want them to produce something that is substantially similar to what we first asked them to understand. We might have even asked them to memorize that at some point in an earlier grade, but then don't regurgitate it. Well, why did I memorize it if I'm not regurgitating it? We want them to transform the work in their product, in what they hand into us, but never in their understanding. Have you ever thought about how confusing that is? We tell them there are wrong interpretations of Freud or something like that. Well, look, you read it, right? But I don't want you to transform that in your mind. I want you to keep Freud as true to the text as you can possibly keep Freud. There are wrong interpretations of Freud, but then when you apply it, we want you to depart from the text. Oh man, what do you want? You want me to understand, even memorize, stick to the text, or you want me to depart from the text? Okay. We want them to think like other people have thought. Say, for instance, use the theory of Foucault. Think like other people have thought, and then we tell them, you're not thinking for yourself in this paper. Man, what? And we might even want them to like analyze source material in the style of theory X, right? Act as if you are a new critic or a formalist or a symbolist when you analyze The Great Gatsby, right? But then we don't want them to actually copy any of the ideas of theory X. Well, but if you're going to talk about formalism, of course, you're going to need to attribute the ideas, cite it, etc. Never claim these ideas as your own. So we want them to use the style, but with some sort of attribution. So my question is, should we instead treat our students like virtuous humans? Should we say to them, look, emulation is important, but the goal is to live your own life, to think your own thoughts in a way that emulates the best characteristics of others and doesn't copy them. Now, what I want to do now is basically give you this assignment that I think, or I hope Lale is showing in front of you, to kind of put yourself in the shoes of your students, okay? They're being introduced into a world of learning, which, as I've just laid out to you, is super confusing. They don't have the familiarity that you do with the field that you teach or the texts that you use or the data sets that you use or the math that you teach or the theories that you teach, right? They got to get up to speed really, really quick and somehow learn to do a complicated set of things, emulate the analytical behavior of others, but never copy it, think for themselves. Okay, so this is what I want you to do. Imagine you had until next Monday to write a paper that your colleagues are actually going to read for your promotion, but it's on a topic you're not familiar with. Oh, this sounds like a nightmare, like waking up from a nightmare, right? You've taught in this general field, but you haven't looked into this specific topic, and your career rides on you producing something that clears the bar, that gets your colleagues' attention, that gets you promoted. You've got to use unfamiliar source materials. They've got to use an unfamiliar data set or an unfamiliar text. You've got to use Dostoevsky when you usually teach The Great Gatsby or something like that. You've got to use unfamiliar theories, maybe scientific theories. You've got to do string theory when in fact that's not the way you usually teach your students physics. You've got to use a different interpretive theory maybe. You've got to use Foucault when ordinarily you use Freud. And you've got to include a literature review to say how it is that people have written about this topic before. So I'm going to shut up for 120 seconds at least here. And I'd like you to write down in the chat 3 concrete steps that you would take. Oh, I see some people are already doing it, right? 3 concrete steps that you would take in order to begin this very confusing, somewhat familiar, but confusing. Okay, you've got to Google, you got to read. So Google the specific topic, read it and Google some more. I want to ask those of you who are saying Google, I want to ask, well, how would you know what's supposed to go into the literature review in your field just through Google? Like you got to cite people who commonly talk about this topic Google Scholar would be a first step. Library databases, reach out to colleagues. Hey, Lisa and any others, when you reach out to a colleague, what would you be asking them about? Okay, Susie is starting to think along the lines of our next part of this assignment, right? Okay, first get the lay of the land. Google Scholar, general research, library databases, okay? Rabbit hole, 5 other topics, Karen. That sounds interesting. Read the first 10 articles that come up in the library, right? That's D. Mauder said that. I think that's on the assumption that those articles are going to be the most commonly used. Then from those, find the 5 common authors. Okay, so you could start with random things and get to the 5 most common authors to put in your literature review. Focus on those 5 authors' work. Okay. Google search, read articles, go to a library database. Look for gray literature. Corey, I'm kind of interested in what gray literature is. Leverage AI, we're going to talk about that in a second. Yeah, Wikipedia source list might narrow it down for you. Okay, so I do want to ask, remember, one of the things you have to do is use a theory that you don't commonly use here, right? I want to ask maybe for some refinement. If you've already dropped some ideas in, and their ideas just about going to library databases, etc., you've learned how to find the most commonly used sources, but how would you find out how to use this unfamiliar theory? Mm-hmm. Oh, thanks, Corey. That helps. Working papers. Mm-hmm. Yep. Mm-hmm. Okay, so I think Tanya is helping us to narrow in there. I see Lisa is commenting again as well. Tanya is helping us to narrow in there, in that she's saying, talk to an expert, right? In order to brainstorm a particular slant that you're going to take on the material. That might be the application of the theory. So look for connections between this field and that for which I already have good knowledge. Okay, excellent. Oh, yeah. And then bootstrap from the things you know, right, to things you can say about this field. Review the references used in other work. Familiarize yourself with the topic by doing a Google search, brainstorm topic with a colleague. And then I had asked a specific question of Lisa, and I think she provided an answer. Okay, yeah, the sources also talk about how to use the theory. Okay. Find a specialist and talk to them first. Rye, I love it. Go right for the personal. Research yourself. Oh, your idea has popped out. And then write for yourself. Okay, so now what I want to do, actually, and Lale, if you could go to the next slide, right? If you were watching those thoughts come in, right? We actually all know, right? So think about what this demonstrated. If you had to start college over again, think about how much better you would be at it now, right? Because you'd be introduced to an utterly new discipline. You'd be told to both know the existing literature, but not copy ideas from it. You'd be told to both know precisely what an interpretive text or theory means, right? But then attribute properly and think for yourself instead. You'd be thrown into a really difficult environment of having to understand what it means to be academically honest, right? And over the many years that you have been a teacher in a high school or that you have been a professor, you have seen behaviors. This is what I want to focus on for all of you. You have seen behaviors that people can engage in to quickly come up to speed on background knowledge within a field, theoretical interpretation within a field, the conversation that's going on within a field in the background literature, and etc. The landscape that's out there of expertise, and etc. So you actually are able to do the complicated tasks just by virtue of your virtues, your virtuosity. of having seen scholars do this work and learn to do it yourself, you could actually take a college course in another topic and probably write an academic paper in about a week. Right? You could get an A in that class in about a week. Students don't have all that expert knowledge. They don't have all that behavior to model. So how could they use AI to engage in some of the same stuff? And here I want you maybe to come up with one AI hack for each of the steps that you saw, or at least for one of the steps that you saw. Right? How might they, for instance, use it to find out what the main scholarly conversation is? Someone said the 5 top sources most often cited. How would they use AI to engage in that scholarly conversation? Right? Go back in the chat and see any of the things that people were talking about, their academic skills that people have acquired to gain and process new knowledge. Go back in the chat, look at any of those, and try to turn it into a prompt. Request an expert persona to interrogate. Yep, that's like exactly what people said they would do to be a scholar. Use it to find the biggest takeaways. Right? Yep. I don't have much time to read Foucault or learn string theory. What are the biggest takeaways? Could you tell it to me like I'm a 3-year-old? Yeah, which AI tool are we using? Thank you, Lisa. You all have been learning that matters. Yeah. Ask AI for a summary of the theory with resources for deeper study. As an academician, I need to learn about the most important aspects of the theory on X, Y, Z. Oh, fantastic. So you're giving it an identity there, right? So you're saying at an academic level, as an academician, I need to learn about the most important parts of string theory. Please list them out, 1, 2, and 3. Yeah, great that you're thinking about specific tools to use as well. Ask AI to take on your role and summarize theory with references. Perplexity, I think, was suggested because it could bring references. Is that right? Which are the most influential texts? Summarize the key points from them. Yep. Wonderful. Ask AI to give examples of applications, right? Hey, so Foucault's theory has been used most commonly to analyze what type of text. Could you give me an example of what people might say if they were using Foucault to analyze that text? You'd want your example to look like that. Okay. All right. Now I want you to keep this conversation going during the course of this week, if you can, right? So to summarize where I've gotten to up to this point, right? I first wanted to argue to you that rights, this conversation about AI and rights, is not fully irrelevant, but doesn't capture what we really want students to be learning, right? What we really want them to be doing when they obey plagiarism rules or anti-plagiarism rules. It doesn't really capture everything that we want from students. So we may want to model good behavior when it comes to rights, but rights talk only gets us so far. Virtue talk gets us further. It gets us to thinking to ourselves, what behaviors of scholarly production, what behaviors of thinking for yourself, what behaviors of using and analyzing texts, data, scientific theories, and et cetera, could we model for them? And then how could we use that to do in AI to do sort of the same thing? So Lale, if you could drop to the next slide. All right. I actually want to come back to that one instead and go to slide 12 instead, which is labeled the Magnificent Seven, Lale, because I'm going to do an example first and then come back to slide 11. Okay. Now, I don't think I need to teach you too much about the things I call the Magnificent Seven here. You'll have this slide for later if you want to remember what my 7 are. I do like references to the Clash, so hence the Magnificent Seven. But many of you were doing this when I said, create AI prompts there that would model the scholarly behavior that you need to engage in, right? You were giving the AI an identity. Tell her who it is. you're giving it clear contextual instructions, right? Do it for this assignment, Lisa said. As an academician, write an assignment that is about the Great Gatsby or whatever it might be. Give it examples, right? You may even ask it for an example, as someone said. Like, give me an example of how Foucault might analyze the Great Gatsby or something like that. Okay, now thinking about that, what are the main lessons that we draw about Foucault? Tell it to look up sources. That works in Bing, works in Perplexity. Some of you thought about those things, right? Because you need then to reference those sources. Insert your own knowledge, right? Some of you went directly to that. You were like, well, as an expert in the field, I would know that my field, or as an expert in an adjacent field, I would know that in what I do, it looks like this. So I could bootstrap some knowledge of what it should look like in the new environment. So insert your own knowledge, right? The product that you create would look like this. Give it steps to follow, right? First, actually do an analysis of string theory, then in 150 words, then bullet point that down to the 3 points, and then tell me how this topic might be affected by string theory so that I can write this paper. And then push back always, right? So what I'd like for you to do now, Lale, is go to the next slide. And in the spirit of academic honesty, I want you to know that this is an adaptation of a prompt that Ethan Mollick of the University of Pennsylvania was using for a really, really long time. This is a very simple early prompt that he was using. It's the AI tutor. And if you gave, many of you went directly to this, be an academician and then do an analysis of X, right? If you give it an identity, like the identity of a tutor, right? And then you tell it to interact with you in such a way that it models good academic behavior, right? And if you helped your students by maybe helping them build such a prompt that they could then use to speak to as they are writing a paper, right? And this, of course, would have to be, customized to your own field in some ways, giving it a very specific identity. But if you gave it something like a tutoring prompt, told it what to be, gave it some background knowledge and so on and so forth, then the process of engagement with the bot could itself be the process of scholarly production. You know what that process is. You dropped it all right there in the chat. You know for sure that if your life really depended on it, you'd be able to write that academic paper in a slightly adjacent field. You know that. So you know what scholarly production is, and you know how to teach your students to engage in scholarly production. Now, Lale, if you could stop the share there, and I'm going to do a brief interaction with, if I can find ChatGPT. Please, ChatGPT, I hope you're out there for my share screen. Sorry, folks. I don't know why it's not showing. Let me try it this way. If I flip to, it's giving me the same problems I had before. So let's actually do this instead, since I can't show you how I would use this very, very simple prompt to engage with ChatGPT. Let's instead, I'm gonna try it one more time, but I can't get it to do it. How about we give a minute for each of you to go ahead, and if you want to crib that simple prompt, I'll put it in the chat. I'll actually cut and paste it into the chat so you don't have to get it off of the slides there. And why don't you go into your preferred bot right now and actually use the tutor prompt and interact with it about your own academic work. Say, I want to tutor on my academic work. I was going to ask it to be a tutor on the property theory of John Locke, as if that isn't, as if ethics isn't already boring enough. That's one of my specialties, the property theory of John Locke. But you can ask it to be an expert on whatever you want it to be. And then, again, engage with it with precisely the steps that you dropped in the chat. Find what are, for instance, the first 10 sources that pop to mind for it. Find what are the most commonly used sources with respect to this. Ask it about a theory commonly used in your field and how it might analyze that theory, right? Just go back, you could go back randomly into the chat and say, oh, these are academic skills, academic virtues that we know, right? How can I engage with the bot and get it to help me learn that academic virtue? I'll shut up here for a few minutes so you can try it on your own. And I'll answer some of the questions in the Q&A. Okay, that's good. Very good feedback, Lisa. So you have to refine the prompt in order to really have your students engaging with it as scholars would. Well, yes, Margaret, I mean, in-text citations or failing to attribute your use of the bot, we'll get into that in just a second. Failing to attribute your use of the bot or making up citations, et cetera, would be academic dishonesty in any context, right? But as I'll say in a second, I ask my students to hand in these chat logs, right? So I ask them to engage with a scholarly bot and hand in the chat logs and then write about that, not just simply hand it in. Oh, thank you, Julie. I do think it's a good idea. But that means I require them to use AI. Engage with it, practicing scholarly skills, which are specifics for us, right? We know why we're going to databases. There's a specific reason we're doing that. We now know why we're looking for the top 5 cited articles in a field. There's a specific reason we're doing that. And so if you give them specifics, these are the things you do to act like a scholar, they end up learning quite a bit about how they could analyze a particular problem or answer a particular question. Yeah, Marina, in that instance, you might give it an example of qualitative market research. Like if you had ownership of it, a report from an ad agency or something like that. Give it an example and say, this is what I mean by qualitative market research. Now, could you do this? Yeah, exactly, Angie, right? So if we know that one of the skills that we're teaching them is you can't know that, I say this to my students often, you can't know actually that an idea is your own until you've read a couple of different articles within the field. So you know that at least a few people didn't have your idea yet. So you got to know what their ideas are so that you know how to say a different one, right? So likewise, if it keeps on giving you back the same answers, you say, hey, chatbot, take this from another angle, right? Imagine you were a Freudian scholar doing physics, right? What might your take on physics be? I agree with that, Tanya. Yes. Yes, Lisa. If people haven't seen Lisa's, I feel like I'm not going to screenshot Lisa's comment because I think this is a private meeting and ought to be. But Lisa, if you ever want to email me that comment and have a conversation about it, if there's anything this session was meant to show, it's something Lisa said there in the chat. Yeah. Have AI generate a reference list, have it apply a theory to an idea, have it be scholarly, have them be scholarly. Yeah. Okay. Someone named B. Sumrold is asking, I'm sorry that I don't know your full name, asking in the Q&A about how you get them to dive deep into an original document, like something like primary research or something. Well, if that document is already digitized, you can feed it in within the context window. You can say, you know, this is the prompt, analyze this document that I've uploaded, right? And you can have it query it. I said in response to somebody else's question, yeah, one of the first things I did when the bots got better is I said, be James Madison, right? And I started asking it pretty arcane questions about James Madison's philosophy. Nobody really knows much about mid 18th century Scottish psychology, what's called faculty psychology of the from the Scottish schools, but that's what James Madison used to write his work, right? The bot all of a sudden knew, basically could start saying pretty decent things about James Madison's work. Okay, so I want to come back here. Thank you for what you've been doing there. And Lale, in order to close this out, I'd like to go back to slide 11. All right. And hopefully that's showing for you all now. Earlier I said, yes, I see now that it is showing for you. And earlier I said, hey, there's a problem in the very simple description of academic integrity that that we at Princeton give to our students, right? Because it's really actually hard to know what does it mean by the origin of work? What does it mean that the student is the origin of work? What does it mean that the work is their own work, right? And that it raises the questions for us. How do we convey to a student that the work we care about is not necessarily the words or the solutions on the page? Someone was saying in the chat, they're still concerned about academic integrity. Of course. Because if the students are going to hand in, if they're going to hand in words that were generated by ChatGPT after an exercise like this, right? Then they're not getting the point of it. How do we convey to them that we don't, it's not about the words that you hand in, but the skills that you exercise while you are doing this, right? How do we clarify what the origin and my own mean in an academic integrity statement like this? And I'll show you my own policy that I've used in a second here, but I actually would like to maybe use the chat if we can here. Lali, we're going to close with slide 16, but not yet. In the chat here, and maybe just 60 seconds of reflection. If you have any reflection on, now that you've thought about how you would be the origin of a brand new academic project that you had never thought about before, and now that you've thought a little bit about how you could use AI to be the origin of new thoughts, could you write out a definition of original work? And I know that's abstruse, right? But it's a place to start in writing your own policy. Yes, yes, B. Summerlud, apologies on the name again. That's fantastic, actually. Turn it from just a statement of originality to, in this class, originality means demonstrating these 5 skills. Metacognitive approach to assignments, yes, yes. Yes. Yes, Lisa. Yes, I'm cheering again. Yes, focus on the process that they can engage in with the AI, not on the final thing that they hand in. Yeah, Maureen, I go even further and I say, you must use this. You must at least engage with a specialized version of the tutor bot that I created for them. You must engage with it and hand in the chat logs, right? So I can then compare it to whoever was talking about academic integrity later. If I suspect that the paper came out of a bot or whatever, I can see, well, what did it actually learn from the bot? What did the student actually learn from the bot? And did they at least go through the steps of original work? Demonstrate your academic skills and list a series of skills. Yes. SWBAT. I don't know what that is, but it sounds good. Yes, Isabel. And when I've spoken before with writing programs, whatever, I think they grok AI, large language models, generative AI, they grok it immediately. Right? They're like, process. I can just think through process. Yeah, how do you organize the research project and write the AI prompts, right? Remember, Marina, I suggested to all of you actually that when it comes to copyright, US law is actually now moving towards prompting as being the thing that is copyrightable, the thing that is human activity, the thing that is input into the machines, the things that you, Marina, might own if you have prompted the machine well and got it to produce great analysis. Students will be able to. I love it. Yeah, okay, now I know, Lisa. Excellent. Okay. Now, I just want to close out. I hope that you're thinking about that on your end, how you could define original work. The comments that I saw were spot on, just amazing. I want to close out with slide 16, which is just something that you can refer to later. I'm sorry I took up quite a lot of time, but I'm going to stick around for questions. Right. Maybe back up. Did I put my sample academic integrity policy in there? Yeah. Okay. This is the first one I used, and I actually came up with it just as GPT-4 was being announced. I kind of shifted on my classes, and I was like, hey, we've got a new thing. We've got an academic virtue policy, but you see it in front of you. Hand in with every assignment a list of the models you used. Hand in a list of all the prompts you used to query the AI. If you give it poor prompts, you can expect poor results. Hand in with every assignment a list of the top 5 AI-generated outputs that you double-checked, right? Because again, I've said, yeah, we can have someone do that, Monica. Thank you. We'll put that into the chat, right? one of the things you've learned is you always need to push back against these bots. When they say, this is how Freud would analyze X or whatever, you say, would every Freud scholar believe that, right? What if we looked at another part of Freud? What if we looked at his idea of the death drive or something like that? Would the answer end up being the same, right? And then, of course, for their own protection, extremely important. I always include, I've elaborated this significantly over time, but I always include the last one. Don't put anything into it that you want to remain private, because not all these bots protect your privacy. Okay. Sorry, I ran a little long there, only 10 minutes long in terms of what I had planned to do with you all, but I will stick around for questions in the chat here. Tim says, he just came across an institutional policy on AI which requires faculty to use one of the 4 pre-written statements on AI use on all syllabi. What is your take on having policies on AI, including this approach? Yeah, I wouldn't want any school out there to dictate to all of their faculty what the AI policy is going to be. But if any of those 4 AI policies say that part of it can be customized by the professor, then what I would suggest is customize it into an academic virtue policy, right? And if you don't like the word virtue because it sounds old-fashioned, just make it an academic skills policy. These are the skills I'm actually teaching. These are how I want you to use it. Yes, Marina, excellent question, but that's what you're supposed to work on this week, your definition of original work. I'd like you to keep on thinking about that, because it's going to be very specific to your discipline as well. What does it mean to be the origin of a paper in your discipline? What does it mean to be the origin of a lesson plan? Right? It doesn't always mean to come up with a whole cloth, right? What does it mean in terms of engagement with other lesson plans? What does it mean in terms of engagement with experts, the experts you wanted to talk to, and et cetera? What's it mean in your field to be the origin of a piece of work? Let's see. Apply good historical hermeneutics. Yeah. One of the things I've discovered that is useful is actually to get it, if there's an interpretive mode that you want the bot to use for texts, right? Feed a large scale text into it, but then get it to summarize that text. Okay, so this is the interpretive method. It's expressed here in this 30-page paper, right? And if you've got a bot now with a context window big enough for a 30-page paper, this will work. You feed the 30-page paper in, and then you say, what I want is a 1,500-word summary of this interpretive method that ends in 5 bullet points that are the steps for this method. Right, and then you could save that. The bot has given you a summary of the interpretive method, right? And it's not going to remember that forever because its context window closes at a certain time. But you could save it in a document somewhere, and then when you prompt it, say, "Remember, I want you to use this method." Right, and you can also double check it to whether the 1,500 words is on track or not on track. Hey, Susie, love it. Ask it what it means for work to be original under copyright law, right? And then ask it, I would ask a bot whether it is capable of doing original work, and then maybe ask it other things about how to summarize, what more could we say about originality, right? Because like I suggested, copyright law is only going to give you the barest minimum definition of what is protected work and what is original work. Yeah, standardized syllabi. Well, if you can't make it part of a course policy, make it part of a course lesson, right? It's day 2 of the course, and we're going to do this bot exercise together. Oh, and it turns out this lesson is part of every lesson that comes after this. Functionally a policy. Yes, Amy, go ahead and use that policy verbatim. You don't even have to give me credit, but the policy probably does need to be tailored to your experience and what you are teaching. All right. You may want more. You may want the students to look at interpretive theories. You may want them to, et cetera, right? So you may want to add more to it. Yes, Maria, you can get them to be super specific. Yeah, Lisa, I hadn't thought about that before. What would a bot respond if you wrote a paper and asked it whether it was original? Would it do an overly straightforward analysis like Turnitin does, and just tell you, well, some parts of this aren't original because I find them in my training data? Or would it give you a better definition of originality? I think you got to give this. I suspect that you got to give the bot a definition of originality, right? The major scholars in my field who think about John Locke's Second Treatise of Government, just to use something that I worked on in the past, right? The major scholars are named Leo Strauss and James Tully, let's say. There are others, but right? I'd like you to think about how would Leo Strauss analyze this particular part of John Locke's theory? Okay, now how would James Tully do it? Right? How might we question Leo Strauss's idea? And could you provide me evidence from John Locke's Second Treatise of Government that Strauss might be wrong in some of the things that he says? Right. So I would be more inclined not to have them ask the bot whether their work is original, but to make sure that they go through the steps of inquiring, right? How people have previously interpreted the text and what new might be said of it and what might be wrong in previous interpretations. Yeah, Cheryl, I've heard conflicting things on that. I've heard in some instances that it can identify bot written work, in other instances that it's very inaccurate in identifying bot written work, right? Now, I'm sure a lot of people dropped off the call already, but one take-home message for anybody who's still there, one of the things I always want to say to people is, you know what these bots are going to do? I don't think they are just sophisticated cheating machines. I think they're actually going to raise the bar on original student academic production, because now we're going to be able to take the virtues that we have, the skills that we have, the knowledge we have about the process of how to do original work, right? And we're less concerned about whether they just get 1,500 words on paper. Now we can actually say, hey, it's actually kind of easy for you to explore what the field has said about this topic. It's easy for you to get a contradictory opinion, right? It's easy for you to find a counter argument to this. It's easy for you to find a new text or theoretical source or idea that we haven't even talked about in this class and explore that, right? So the bar is actually only going up with AI. I think we should be less concerned about the students who are just going to be below the bar and turn in some bot written dribble. And with that, I will stop.
That's great. Thank you so much, Stephen. This was really fascinating. I'm kind of a theory guy myself, and so I was like geeking out behind the scenes.
Yeah.
So fantastic. Really, really wonderful. Great talk. And I love the
Very
ways.
glad to hear that, Sean.
Love the ways you
people are good with me.
So it's fantastic. Thank you so much for taking the time and for staying a little bit longer to answer people's questions. Really appreciate that too. So
glad to, and feel free to do follow-up questions later. Of course, Hero knows my email and etc. People can find me.
Absolutely. All right. Thank you so much.
Excellent. Really good to talk to everybody. Bye now.